Hello and welcome back to the channel. Before we start, I wanted to give a disclaimer and a trigger warning. Today's video is going to talk a fair bit about body size. I promise to do my absolute best to make this video as encouraging as possible and to reduce any potential triggering. That being said, I will be talking about how different body sizes are impacted with issues due to gauge, grading, blocking, and different fibers. And I know talking about body size can be triggering for some people. I want you to know, though, that no matter the shape or size of your body, you deserve to have clothing that fits you the way you want it to, the way you like it to, and that it makes you feel confident when you're wearing it. I hope this video encourages you and gives you the knowledge you need to do just that. All right, let's talk. Over the past month, I have done a huge deep dive into what gauge is and why and how to do it right. But why am I so passionate about gauge and about blocking your gauge swatches? Because incorrect gauge in garment making means you're not going to have a finished piece that fits as it's intended. And here's the kicker. Incorrect gauge disproportionately affects plus size makers. So I think a part of my job as a size inclusive garment designer is to stress the importance of getting correct gauge. Every time. I'm not going to talk much about the importance of size inclusivity today because at this point we should all know that it is incredibly important that everyone, no matter their body shape, should be able to craft themselves a handmade wardrobe and that those pieces should look and fit similarly across the spectrum of bodies that they're being made for. Instead, I'm going to talk about how gauge, blocking, and fiber stretching disproportionately impacts plus size makers and what we as a whole maker community can do to minimize these issues for our plus size peers. First things first, we've talked all month about what gauge is and how to get it right from a maker's perspective, but not necessarily why it matters so much to designers. Essentially, the gauge of a pattern is what a designer uses to figure out how many stitches and rows or rounds to do to make a piece for each size. This figuring out of how many stitches and rows or rounds are needed for each size is called grading. That's grading with a D, like getting good grades or grading in landscaping, not like grating cheese. Let's do an analogy. Think of your stitches like bricks, and please forgive me for this analogy. Our bodies are not like houses, but this is just a concrete example that I think will be fairly universally understood. If someone is building a house, and you know the size of that house, and you know the size of each brick, you can relatively easily, with a little bit of math, figure out how many bricks across and how many bricks high the house is going to be, and therefore how many bricks you need. But if the shipment comes in, and the bricks are the wrong size, you're either going to need to change the number of bricks or you're going to have to change the size of the house. Remember, the bricks here are our stitches and the house is our body. Neither of those things is easy to change on the fly, and we should never have to change the size of our body to fit our clothing. This same concept applies to our stitches. We need to ensure our stitches are the same size as the designers so that we know we're making it the size that it's intended to be in order to fit our body based on that number of stitches and that number of rows that the designers figured out in their grading process. Now, what do I mean when I say it disproportionately affects plus size makers? If everyone is off by 2 stitches in their gauge, doesn't that mean that it's all the same? No, because being off by 2 stitches in a 4-inch section means you'll be off by a whole lot more over a 60-inch section than you would over a 30-inch section. Let's go through an example together. Imagine you're working on a pattern that has a gauge of 10 stitches by 10 rows in 4 inches or 10 centimeters. Like me, the designer used the Craft Yarn Council's standard women's sizes to grade their patterns. So size 1, the extra small, has a finished bust circumference with a touch of positive ease at 32 inches and it's 80 stitches. Size 9, the 5X, has a finished bust circumference of 64 inches or 160 stitches and that 2 inches of positive ease. Let's look at how getting a blocked gauge that is 1 stitch off impacts the size 1 maker versus the size 9 maker. And we'll do it both ways, whether you're getting 1 stitch more or 1 stitch less in that 4-inch swatch. If you're getting 9 stitches per 4 inches, so 1 fewer stitch in 4 inches, the extra small is now 35.6 inches in circumference, which is 3.6 inches larger than the designer intended. For the 5X, the bust circumference would now be 71.1 inches, which is 7.1 inches larger than the designer intended. So now instead of 2 inches of positive ease on a 62-inch bust, this maker is getting over 9 inches of positive ease just from being 1 stitch off. That is a lot of extra fabric, and that piece is not going to look the same as the sample. Going the other way, let's look at what happens if you get 11 stitches in 4 inches. The extra small would be 29.1 inches or 2.9 inches smaller than intended, and the 5X will be 58.2 inches or 5.8 inches smaller than intended. So for the extra small, that basically just eliminates the positive ease, making it a fitted garment. But for the 5X, their sweater now has a few inches of negative ease, meaning it will be very tight on their body when it's not intended to be. The exact same type of impact is seen with the stretching of fibers due to blocking and wearing of garments. If a garment grows by 10% when it's blocked, for someone with that 30-inch bust, that's only 3 inches change. But for someone with a 60-inch bust, that's 6 inches of change. The vast majority of growth fibers experience after being made into a crocheted garment can be accounted for by blocking and tugging on your swatch a little bit with the same amount of weight that you expect gravity and the full weight of your project to have on your stitches. And that's not even considering what I talked about in last week's video about how different fibers stretch differently when they're blocked. There's just so many things to consider. Over the years, I have also heard many makers and designers say, "It's okay if I don't get row gauge on a top-down sweater. I'll just do more rows to make it longer." While this is true, you can add more rows or rounds to a top-down sweater to make it longer. You'll be making more stitches, which is more fabric, which is more yarn. So you'll end up using more yarn than the estimate in the pattern, and you might not have the extra yarn. So again, getting correct blocked gauge is going to keep you closer to the yarn usage estimate provided by the designer in the pattern. To sum this whole feeling up, if you see a designer who is not encouraging makers to swatch and block their swatches and is using the try on as you go method as the only way to test fit, that is a major red flag. Then we also need to consider the fact that the time and monetary cost of making clothing out of yarn is greater for plus size folks. And therefore, if there's an error in gauge and the final piece doesn't fit, the amount of time and money that that maker invested is greater. It also comes with a mental and emotional toll too, because if someone makes a garment and it doesn't fit their body the way that it's supposed to, but it's just a gauge error or potentially a grading error from the designer, the person may think that it's something wrong with them or their body. It's time for a reminder. It is never your body's fault if things aren't fitting correctly. Never. It might be a gauge issue, it might be a grading issue on the designer's part, or something else. It is never your body's fault. I'll leave you today with one piece of advice on how to choose a good size-inclusive pattern. And this is going to ruffle some feathers. For the most part, I recommend steering clear of made-to-measure patterns. And you might ask yourself, why? I thought they were the most size inclusive of all of the patterns. Some are, most are not. For example, a lot of the made-to-measure drop shoulder patterns I have seen do not include any type of bust, shoulder, or underarm shaping. They're just 2 rectangles that are sewn together. And our bodies are 3-dimensional. We need some depth. For a small busted person, this style will be like a slight drop shoulder because that person's bust measurement is only slightly larger than their shoulder to shoulder measurement. But for someone with a larger bust, the drop shoulder is going to fall way further down the arm. This leads to an excess of fabric in the underarm area and making the sweater look a whole lot different on a plus size body than it should. Because the goal should always be for our designs to look similar across the spectrum of bodies. Secondarily, most of these style of patterns that I've seen encourage you to just make until you reach a certain amount of inches or centimeters. But they don't include instructions for how to account for growth due to blocking. This is not to say that all made-to-measure patterns are like this, or that you shouldn't be buying or using made-to-measure patterns. It just means to be wary, to ask questions, and to look for photos of that design on a plus-size body before committing to purchasing or making that design. Not sure if a made-to-measure pattern has shaping in the upper body? Reach out to the designer and ask before you purchase. Now, if you are a designer who does made-to-measure patterns and you're feeling upset by what I said, I am sorry. I know the vast majority of us are doing our absolute best to make designs as accessible as possible, and we are all learning and growing together about how to make the knitting and crochet world more accessible and more size inclusive. Your work and your art are still worthy of existing, and I hope this discussion encourages you to find new, unique ways to include shaping for plus size folks in your made-to-measure designs. Because it absolutely is possible to have made-to-measure patterns that are also size inclusive with their shaping. You may be wondering why I am so passionate about gauge and size inclusivity. First is, I absolutely love to see makers wearing clothing that they made with their own two hands. I think every maker, no matter the shape or size of their body, should get to experience that joy and that little confidence boost you get from wearing a garment that you made yourself. On the other side of that coin is I hate seeing makers disappointed that something doesn't fit them the way they wanted it to. And therefore, they don't want to wear it and they don't feel confident or comfortable when they're wearing it. And then from a business perspective, I want makers to love making and wearing their own clothes because those makers are more likely to make more garments, and that means I can continue to design new patterns and grow my business. So my motivations are both intrinsic and extrinsic because I love humans and I'm forced to live in this capitalist world. And that's it. I can't believe it, but this is the end of my last Gauge Month video. If you watched each video or just stopped by for this one, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so happy that you're here, and I hope you'll keep coming back to continue learning about other educational topics in the crochet world. Happy crocheting, everyone! See you next time.